as well as tonight, Daniele Salvoldi is going to be talking to us. He has a PhD from the University of Pisa in Egyptology, of course, and his dissertation was about Alessandro Ricci. And in 2009, Daniele found this lost travel account from this Italian explorer and published it at AUC Press in 2019. From 2014 to 16, he was a postdoctoral fellow at the Free University of Berlin, working on a history of the GIS of Nubia. And now he's with AUC as an adjunct assistant professor teaching Egyptian architecture, ancient Egyptian architecture. And he also teaches at the Arab Academy of Science, Technology, and Maritime Transport. He has two particular focuses he's interested in as an Egyptologist: the late 18th dynasty and also Coptic culture history, which I think fits in with the topic of his lecture tonight. So without more ado, I'll bring you Dr. Salvoldi.
Thank you very much for the introduction, Dr. Sabahi. Thanks, members of the audience. I think I can start sharing the PowerPoint, and you should be able to see it, right? So I can start. It's a bit of a venture outside of a little bit the borders of Egyptology, stricto sensu. We'll start a bit later with Hellenistic Egypt, and then we basically come through contemporary Egypt. Actually, I'll do the opposite. I'll start from contemporary Egypt and go back in time, if possible. So I'll first talk about this devotional practice of baking the Fetir al-Melek. My volume, okay. Maybe I have to raise my voice. I can't change the volume of the microphone. I think it's good. Sorry, just let me try something. There is a comment about the microphone, so let me see the settings. Output. Okay, so I think now should be better. So I'll share again. This is the outline for today. I'll be introducing the practice of the Fetir al-Melek Mikhail in Arabic, baking of this bun for Archangel Michael. And I'll briefly talk about the Archangel Michael, the devotion that he is object to in Egypt. And then I'll go back to 2,000 years or more for a passage of Plutarch that actually inspired me to try to understand more about this practice. And then I will discuss how it happened, stamping, what is the iconography involved in the stamping of the bread, what are the dates of these feasts, and if they match with anything that was done before, and the concept of the bread itself. Fetir al-Melek Mikhail is something that I don't think a lot of people are aware. Well, I come from a completely different background, so when I was introduced to it, for me it was a sort of curiosity. It happens in households in Egypt where devout people, every feast of the Archangel Michael, that in the Coptic calendar happens on the 12th of each month, so every month. The night before, the day before, people bake certain amount of this bun, sort of bread, but slightly sweet. I can share the recipe at the end if you want. And they do it with a sort of domestic ritual. So there must be the icon of the Archangel Michael, there must be a candle lit in front of it, and you can play from a computer or any device the appropriate hymns for the feast of the Archangel Michael. So somehow it's a liturgy that is confined in the houses of people. It doesn't belong to the church. It's not really controlled by the church. And So not only when I met it the first time, I didn't know what was it, but there is no literature. So when I started to, okay, so what is this about? I want to read something more. There's nothing. No, there is no mention of it. There is absolutely lack of any historical background. So it's even more interesting. So yeah, if you bake as much as you promise, you need to make a vow to the Archangel Michael. You need something, and you receive the grace of the Archangel Michael. Then you somehow pay back by baking this. And the spirit is that whatever you bake, you then distribute to other families, or your friends, the family, or the facilities of the church nearby that then distributes it to the poor. It's an act of somehow of charity. So my mother-in-law, I can say, she's the source of this. She bakes no less than 5 kilos every month, and she's been doing this for a long time. It's flour, it's yeast, it's hot oil, warm hot oil, it's water, it's a little bit of sugar, and a little bit of vanilla essence, which is probably a modern touch to it. No? You let it grow a little bit, and then you have to separate it into small funny bowls, which you eventually stamp with a specific image. Then you bake it for a few minutes, and then she packages it for distribution. Okay. This is the contemporary seal that is used. One is for Virgin Mary, and the other one is for the Archangel Michael proper. We'll see a little bit better later in the detailed discussion of the iconography. There aren't many saints in Egypt who are served with this practice. Mina Megala, who was in the audience, I saw, he told me that only Ambawanas in Luxor has his own bread that you bake. It's a little bit different the way you bake it, and you don't stamp it. But it's made in the same way. You ask for a grace, you receive it, and then you keep baking it for years. No? My mother-in-law has been baking it for 25 years now, which is quite remarkable. Archangel Michael is a pop star in Coptic culture today, and it has been so for quite a long time. It's really famous. It has, as I said, 12 monthly festivals throughout the year, each Coptic month on the 12th day. But two of them are the most important. The 12th of Baona, which is the dedication of a church to Archangel Michael in Alexandria, allegedly in the early Christian period, but probably not so early. And the 12th of Hathor, which is the investiture of Archangel Michael in heaven as the head of the heavenly host, which happens in contemporary with the fall of Satan. Satan is chased away, falls into hell, and Archangel Michael takes his place. So he's now in a very high position. He has sort of Christ-like features, and is sort of the second in command after God. He is the head of the angelic army, so he commands a lot of respect. And this is a very interesting icon that you find in Rashid. Is, I think, one of the oldest in Egypt, if not the oldest, from the 12th century. Unfortunately, I couldn't find any better photo because there is this glass in front of it. My own photo was worse than this one that I found on Google. You see, it has this military attire. The sword is ready to cut. I want to say something more about Archangel Michael. He, if we look throughout the centuries from the appearance of the cult, maybe already in the 4th century CE, but definitely it continues to grow. You have Archangel Michael appearing on tombstones, on amulets, and on magic spells on papyri, and later on parchment, curses as well, well into the Islamic period, 9th, 10th century, and much later. So my question was, what do we know about this practice of honoring the Archangel Michael by baking something? Where does it come from, this idea? What do we have to explain it, and what is the spirit of it? Well, Archangel Michael at the same time was very, very popular in Judaism. In Judaism is the angel who combats evil. It's on the front line. He guards Israel. He watches over the dead. That's why he's later also on tombstones. He is the head of the angelic army again. He officiates as heavenly high priest, so it's sort of also of a sacerdotal priestly figure, very close to God, and is also interceding with God on behalf of humanity. So is somebody that you pray for in order to have God listen to you. Many of these things then appear in the Christian vision of the Archangel Michael, not only in Egypt, but also elsewhere. And it was so popular that also pagans, so not only Judaism and later Christianity, but also pagans from all backgrounds, including Greco-Roman and Egyptian, would be somehow attracted. And there were already figures in the Near East that somehow had similar persona of a warrior, of like a spiritual entity, a power, sometimes portrayed with wings, and they fight in groups like the angels, and they fight evil powers. Sometimes the connection or the sharing of this figure between Christian, pagans, and Jews was very intense, and there was a place in Phrygia called Chonai that Archangel Michael was worshipped like a pagan god. So the church in the Council of Laodicea already had to issue a decree, Canon 35 and 363, forbidding the cult of Michael and giving it the dimension that the church eventually would give it. There is God and there is the angels. It's not, you cannot worship the angels. That's wrong according to the doctrine of the church. Okay, so that's how I met the Archangel Michael, and then it's interesting, and then completely out of this on context, one day, years later, I was reading a passage of Plutarch, the Isidore et Osiride, in which he speaks about different rituals done in Egypt around his time, where there are sacrifices. It says, the first passage is from the Isidore et Osiride 30, and when they make cakes as their sacrifices in the month of Baona and Faofi, they imprint upon them the device of an ass tied by a rope. Then the passage 50 says, for this reason, when they offer sacrifice on the 7th day of the month Tubit, they, which they call the coming of Isis from Phoenicia, so it's still connected to the idea of Osiris and the dismemberment of the body, etc. They imprint on their sacred cakes the image of a hippopotamus tied fast. So there's this interesting idea of imprinting the bread, which for me was new because I was ignorant. Then I discovered that it was quite common in the Hellenistic period. But it's interesting to see how it is done in a ritual that is strongly apotropaic for defense, where even the imagery of the animal that represents Seth, the ass or the hippopotamus, is tied by a rope, tied fast. So it's quite interesting to look at that. So I said, oh, wow, that's interesting. So let me find out more. But maybe I'm naive and you say, was this idiot talking about we knew all of this before? Well, for me, it was new. So I said, okay, let me look into stamping bread and how this culture of stamping bread actually works. It doesn't look like in ancient Egypt it was very popular. We have several forms of and shapes of bread baked in different things. There are also quite recent experiments where they bake bread in this conic molds, and they're quite cool. We have triangular ones. This is in Boston from Dynasty 11. Dynasty 18, this is from the tomb of Ra in Torino, in the shape of an animal who's also fastened. It's quite interesting. But That's it. There is no actual stamping of the things. So we have round, oval, semicircular, spiraling, conical, triangular, hexagonal, animal, and human-shaped bread. We have bread with incisions, bread with holes, bread with palm leaf impressions. But the idea of stamping, I really didn't find it. And if anyone in the audience has a suggestion, I'd be happy to read it. Herodotus, history 247, says that there are pig-shaped dough that is baked and offered as a sacrifice by the Egyptians. Now, Herodotus, we know, to be very careful, but yeah, okay, it fits. I mean, we've seen things in the real life. I want to say something that when we speak about bread in ancient Egypt, we also have specimens that mainly come from tombs. So it's not really the same thing as probably the bread that might have been used in a liturgical service in the temple. And mainly it's stuff that comes from the New Kingdom. So we have no idea what happens later, or very little idea. So I don't know, maybe one day we might find something different. So what about the third intermediate period, or the late period? And obviously the Hellenistic period. Then we get to something. Maybe Assyrian influences, Persian played a role. And then we see that in the Hellenistic period, the idea of stamping the bread is in Egypt already working. There was quite something similar in the ritual, in the liturgy of the Temple of Edfu in the Ptolemaic period. It's a festival of victory, obviously referring to Horus against Seth, and that's the text published in 1950, an image of a hippopotamus made from cake dough is consecrated to him, Horus. We do actually have Horus or falcon-shaped bread. It's not very common, but here it's a hippo. The sacrificial priest comes forward, knife in hand. He first slices, according to the unchanging rule, the right forepaw of the effigy of Seth, while all in attendance sing under the conduct of the first ceremonial, a hymn of triumph in honor of Horus. So there is a practice that is quite interesting to observe. Now, if we look at the rest of the Hellenistic Greek world, we do find a lot of things. It is a Greek idea that is already working. For example, Theocritus speaks about festivals here in this passage, and all the cakes that women fashion on the kneading tray, mingling every hue with fine white wheat flour, there's a mistake, are there, and those they make of sweet honey and smooth oil. All creatures of earth and air are there beside. And then later we have Herodotus, who speaks about, don't forget to bring some of the health bread, the hugies, which, what does it mean? And again, Athenaeus, the cake given to be tasted during the sacrifice, is called hugia, and is referring to a ceremonial for Asclepius. And Hugia, health, is the Greek goddess, the daughter of Asclepius, the god of medicine. And later on, people found, this is Byzantine, but we have also a little bit earlier, stamps with the name Hugia, health. So people actually really got to the temple to get bread stamped with this. So there is a sort of function of the temple to create and distribute bread that is stamped, and people take it and bring it home, and possibly they eat it, and then they take the blessing, sort of. It's quite straightforward, I'd say. And from the Hellenistic period in Egypt, we do have a lot of examples. If you just search database of the British Museum from 2nd century, 1st century BC, all sorts of images from pottery stamps. We do have a Roman stamp. The culture of stamping bread is sometimes religious, like the one we saw in the 3 examples before, but sometimes also economic or logistic. This is a military Roman bread that they stamp for the unit of the centuria, where soldiers are probably given also tokens to go and get the bread from the bakery of the military camp. We have it in the Jewish culture. This is 6th century, Akko. This was used to mark food that was kosher in the Jewish culture. So if you have the menorah, okay, you can eat it. But it continues well into the Islamic period, 9th, 12th century. These are things from Fustat in Cairo. We are in the Ayyubid period, way later. People are still stamping bread. So it is something that is eventually a very strong part of Egyptian culture. Jewish, Christian, Islamic, doesn't really matter. We also have other examples. There is in Alexandria, for example, I want to mention that, which is interesting. There is, you know, that the Hellenistic kings of Egypt, the Ptolemies, are also promoting royal cults. So when a member of the family dies, it becomes a god or a goddess, or there is an association of the cult of Ptolemy or Berenike. So Berenike, the daughter of Ptolemy III, she has her own special bread stamped for her, distributed during the festivals for Berenike herself. It is then later distributed to the priests of this cult in the temple. See, yeah, then I went to the Coptic Museum hoping to find anything related to Michael there. It's not. This is 6th, 7th century. We do have a lot of examples, and some of them are just geometric, flowers, sort of things. This is quite interesting pattern. This is definitely Christian, is the Christ, so it gets more into specific kind of bread that I'll mention in a second. Because in the Byzantine period, in Egypt, but in the rest of the Christian world, stamped bread becomes part of the liturgy. It's what they call the Prosphoron, which is the holy bread that is used during the Christian liturgy, and it is consecrated as the body of Christ and then distributed. That's the Prosphoron. Then we have another kind of bread, which is called the Eulogia or Eulogia, that is not consecrated, baked around the church, and then distributed to pilgrims as a blessing. And they have also stamps with the local saint from the local church. So it's quite common around. I didn't find anything in Egypt about this with Saint Michael. So it's very frustrating. Some of these designs, like the one here, is markedly Christian. So it really tells you, okay, many of them could be anything. It takes some time for the Christians to have their own stamp that are marked. You actually also have menorah type. So the Jewish, ideally the Jewish thing that is also used by the Christians at the beginning. You also have the Greek type Zoe Eugia, life and health, that was used many centuries before. And then with the Christians gets obviously a different meaning. So that's it. Let's have a look at the iconography if we can learn something. It's quite straightforward. You have, this is the one that my mother-in-law uses. It's a very recent icon. You can find it on many Coptic devotional books. It's the Archangel Michael with the shield and the sword. Of course, the wings are important. And then in Arabic we have Malak Rab, the angel of the Lord. And this is a detail that is important. It's not only the image of the angel, but also the name of it, because we will see later that it's a prescription somehow. We do have some older examples. You find them here and there in the market. Well, I haven't, but I saw them published, but there are very few. This one was published in 2014. It's a wooden disc, so probably older than the one we have, but not very old. And the iconography is very interesting. We have the sword, we have the scale, which is part of the idea of Michael as the mediator between God and the people, and also the one who's carrying somehow psychopomp, no? The one who's carrying the souls in the afterlife, and so sort of the judgment, etc., etc. And we have this, I don't know, worm-like feature, but this is very likely to be an image of Satan, the devil, and the Archangel Michael with the sword ready to hit is trampling. See, actually the feet are on it. There are also inscriptions that are not quite clear. I spent some time, but really I couldn't make out. There are some letters. He, lambda, perhaps, might be referred to Michael, but it might be a cipher actually. And this is one that I found also by chance in Cairo. It's not mine, unfortunately, but it's very interesting because beside the texts or the letters that we do have again the same idea of the Archangel Michael with wings, with the sword, this time raised, and the scale in one hand, and the devil being trampled on. The real power of the Archangel Michael. It's a representation of its apotropic, it's protective against the power of the devil. That's the job of Archangel Michael, but it's also sort of the history of the mythology, because Archangel Michael is the one who takes the position of Satan in Christian mythology. So here it's a representation also of that, the change of hierarchy in the heavenly host. Obviously, very similar to what Plutarch said about the bread, the hippopotamus or the donkey tied, fastened, and the Edfu ritual where the priest cuts the image of Seth in the shape of a crocodile. This idea of the fight between the archangel and Satan is then transferred in the religious accounts in sort of historic events. It happens in the sky, in heaven, at the beginning of time, but then it also happens on earth, which is a very typical way of working for magical thinking. There's always a parallelism between the world of God or the gods and the world of the humans, where things happen again in a very similar manner. So the idea is, in several sources, the triumph of the cult of the archangel over the cult of a pagan local god. We have a couple of very early sources: Athanasius of Alexandria in the history of the Arians, and Epiphanius of Salamis against the heretics, where they say that in Alexandria there are many churches, and then there is one church which is the Caesarium, or the Temple of Caesar. That was the one on the harbor marked by the two obelisks, so-called Cleopatra's Needles. Now one is in London, the other is in New York, as you know. But they were in the front of the building in the Roman period. They really don't say much, except that, well, there was this Caesarium complex. Perhaps it was a large area with a temenos and with several buildings, including the temple to Caesar. And this was changed into a church, which is, again, a topos in literature. It has been explored. It doesn't mean that this happened every time. On the contrary, it's quite rare to have this. But Alexandria is a specific place where things happen in a very dramatic and very passionate manner, where people really throw chairs at each other, and it becomes very heated. Later sources are a little bit more specific, and they speak about the change of the Church of the Caesarium into a Church of Saint Michael. The first one to speak about this is John of Nikiu in the 7th, towards the end of the 7th century, where he says that Caesar, not always very accurate, built a beautiful palace and also beautiful and magnificent and comely house. and he named it after his own name and that of his son, Ptolemy 15 Caesar. And when the great Constantine, the emperor of the Christians, took possession of the Roman Empire, he changed this building into a church and named it after the name of St. Michael. And to this day, it is named the Church of Caesarion because it was built by Julius Caesar the Younger and Caesar the Elder. A bit of fantasy. The next one who speaks about this is Eutychius, the Melkite patriarch of Alexandria. It's much later, we are already in the 9th, 10th century. And he's the one again who marks this. So not sure how this tradition came into place, if it was a maneuver to place Michael more and more in the spotlight, or it was eventually a tradition that surfaced only that late. So he says, moreover, there was in Alexandria a large temple that had been built by Queen Cleopatra and dedicated to Saturn. That's an important detail, in which there was a large bronze idol called Michael. And says that the Saturn temple had a Michael statue inside. It's a bit weird. For whom the inhabitants of Alexandria and Egypt celebrated in a day during the month of Hathor, a great festival sacrificing many offerings. Then when Alexander, patriarch of Alexandria, so bringing Christianity, wanted to break the idol and remove the sacrifices, but the people of Alexandria resisted, they didn't like it. So he says is trying to convince them to change the cult by telling them that the idol wouldn't do anything to you. So switch to Michael, and Michael will protect you and will intercede for you with God. And he convinced them, and they agreed to destroy the idol and to make a cross out of it. So he says the temple of the Caesarium was changed into the Church of Michael, and then there was the feast for the celebration of this event. It's very interesting that he says, until now the Copts in Egypt and Alexandria celebrate on that day, that's Hathor, the feast of the angel Michael, and sacrifice a large number of victims. Now, I don't see very often Christians doing blood sacrifice. Maybe somebody can help me, but maybe here he means something else, like a sort of different sacrifice. As the supreme Christian sacrifice is the holy bread on the altar, maybe he's referring to something else. You probably know what I'm going here. He also, famous historian Macrisi, probably used the source of Eutychius of Alexandria because he comes up more or less with the same idea. He calls Saturn Zohel, which is the typical Arabic name for Saturn. And he changed the date to 18th of Hathor instead of 12th of Hathor. But he again speaks about Patriarch Alexander went and spoke to the people and said, okay, let's change this, which is, probably just a repeating of the idea. But he's also saying that the feast is going on very often since that time until now. Of course, it gets into the Synaxarium, the hagiography, the list of saints for each day of the calendar that is celebrated by the Coptic Church. The Synaxarium is a late text. I mean, the manuscripts are not later than 14th century in Arabic. There's nothing older than that. But they definitely draw from earlier sources. And then it's continuously updated. There are, unfortunately, many recensions. And the publication of these texts is not really ideal. So one should really do a lot of work on that. I'm not qualified to wait. But anyway, for the day 12th of Baona, it says that it's the feast of the Archangel Michael, because again, there was this temple in Alexandria dedicated by Queen Cleopatra, daughter of Ptolemy, to Saturn, and his feast was celebrated there on the 12th of Baona. There was a fearful, horrible copper idol called Saturn, Zohel, and many sacrifices were made for him. And then Alexander again goes and speaks to the people, and is very persuasive, and he exhorts them to change, that this idol is just useless, cannot help them, cannot harm them, and if they just change, listen to me, we'll get something good here. And says it's the festival only that of demons, which is a very typical Christian thing in the literature, to say that any god that was worshipped before is a manifestation of Satan. But Saturn is a specific one that is very often associated with Satan, that Satan. So the fact that Saturn and Michael are somehow fighting for their cult in the temple in real life Alexandria is very telling. And again, speaks about the victims or the sacrifices that will be given to the poor, and so the less fortunate will eat. So we can turn that something that is just bloodshed and it's useless thing into something that helps the other. And again, it says this is the church called Caesarea in Alexandria, and the feast is still celebrated to this time. Now, the association Saturn is very interesting, because Saturn and Kronos are very often the typical Satan, the head of the demons, not just one demon. All ancient Egyptian gods are demons, but Saturn is the head of them. And there is also an association between Saturn and Seth, because they both take a crocodile or a hippopotamus shape sometimes, especially in the Fayum. There is, for example, Saint Shenute, the famous Saint Shenute, the preacher, speaks of Kronos, which is the equivalent of Saturn, as Satanas, the Satan. Seth is somehow into this because he has very similar characteristics and also very opposite characteristics. Now, I'm not trying to say Michael is Seth or Michael is Saturn. Many people try to do that. Some people were convinced, some people were not convinced, but we need to look at, there are some points that are interesting. So Seth in many texts, in certain contexts, especially in desert areas, he is in Ombos, in Koptos, in Dakhla, in Kharga, he is a positive character. He is the defensive force for the gods. Papyrus Chastity once says, slaying the opponent of prey daily while I am at the prow of the bark of millions, whereas not any other god is able to do it. Lord of the Oasis, who slays Apophis, the one who has slain Apophis in the prow of the bark of rain. So he is the only god that can do things to protect the supreme god. So we have this sort of head of the heavenly army idea. The opposite is that he is a desert god, and he has very negative connotations, and these are the ones that the Christians like probably to pick. There is this very interesting text, coffin text 168, that was recently rechecked by Harco Willems with a better translation. Says the putrefaction is running aground. The river is drying up after Geb has swallowed for himself the flood, while Shesmu unites his hands around the effeminate testicles. Very horrible idea of torture. But why are the testicles of Seth, who is here referred to, effeminate? Because Seth is the god of the desert, and the desert is sterile. It bears no fruit. In fact, Seth and Nephthys don't have children. The fact that Seth is the desert, the lack of water, is the opposite of what Michael in popular culture, not very much in high liturgy or even high treatises of theology. It's more a popular culture thing. The association with of Michael with the flood of the Nile, with the water, which is a very strong association in Egypt, also in Islam. because it's from the hair of Michael that the rain comes down, and then it is this rain that brings the flood, the growing of the river. So we have several passages, for example, in the Synaxarium, late text says, implore the Lord that his name be exalted for the rising of the Nile. Timothy of Alexandria, much earlier, one of his homilies on Saint Michael, we miserable sinners that we are, obtain through the supplication of Michael the waters of the river Nile. And Eustathius of Trachy, homily perhaps from the early 7th century, Michael will be in conclave with the angels and will be bowing down and praying with all the angel hosts outside the veil of the Father for the waters of the river of Egypt, and for dew and for rain. There is then a connection with water and the rising of the Nile and baking again. So we go back to the real topic. Another way, this is a Makrisi who says there are many ways that the Christians of Egypt use to predict the flood of the Nile. And says, take a little wheat flour, knead it with water from the Nile in a vase made from silt from the river, and leave this vase closed during the whole night before the feast of Saint Michael on the 12th of the month, so the night before. On the morning of the feast, if the dough has risen on its own, the Nile will be quite full, and if on the contrary the dough has not risen, it is a sign that the Nile will be very low. And there are many other things connected with predicting the flood of the Nile that was prerogative of the Christians well into the Mamluk period that are associated with Michael, but at a popular level rather than an official liturgical level. There is another text, the Pseudo Chrysostom. The manuscript is from the 10th century. It attributes, it's in Coptic, it attributes the text to St. John Chrysostom, but in fact, it's a very, very Coptic text. It's probably just a fake attribution. It says the 12th time Archangel Michael descended to earth is on the 12th of the month of Hathor. He tore to pieces in the city of Alexandria and throughout Egypt the idol Boh and Boh Idolon in Coptic, which the Egyptian worship. So it's another version of the same idea of Saturn. It was under Abba Eumenios, Archbishop of Alexandria, that this miracle happened. So the Archbishop and all the other archbishops decided that the Feast of the Archangel Michael would be celebrated all over the world on the 12th of Hathor and on the 12th of each month of the whole year. So the idea of every month of every year, or the 12th of the month of the whole year, there is a feast of Michael that you have to celebrate in a certain way is already there in the 10th century. It's not very early. That's it. So what about the dates? I'm a bit slow. If we go back to the idea of Plutarch talking about stamping against the devil and stamping in a protective manner, very, very interesting. We have this Papyrus Zenon that is, I think, from the mid of the 3rd century CE that speaks more or less of this topic. It's a text is a list actually of supplies that are required for a particular feast, a pagan feast. Let me find it. Yeah. Sorry, I can't find the reference. Because, well, it says, just give me a second, sorry, I just got lost in there. I apologize for this. I just lost the passage of the papyrus that explains. Because papyrus that it dates exactly from the same dates of the festival of, if you see 14th of Bauna and 11th of Beba, Baona and Faofi are the same. And it's a list of things that are required for probably the very same festival that Plutarch is talking about. And it says that we need bread, and he's using the same word, popana here. And he speaks of popana keramica. So bread that is associated with pottery, but it's not bread baked in a certain pottery. It's probably interpreted as bread that is stamped with a certain pottery. So from this papyrus, we actually know that the sources of Plutarch are very accurate. And there was really a feast, and it's attested, and it was made with stamped bread, more or less in those days. So if we look at the list of feasts that are celebrated in Egypt for all these gods that are somehow associated with Saturn or Seth, is the Typhonia between Tot and Baona, Archangel Michael, but also the birthday of Kronos, Saturn, on the 10th of Hathor. We have the 12th of Hathor. Yeah, of course, they're not the same. There is a festival to Isis. Isis is also mentioned in Plutarch. Chiach, we have two festivals again, the Chronia that are the Greek version, and the Saturnalia that are the Roman. They are separate in Egypt. We have a Stolismos of Kronos, but we don't know the date. And there is a feast of the Nile on the 11th of Tuba. So the dates are not really, I am not really trying to say, hey, it's the same feast on the same date, and it was for Saturn or Seth, and then it becomes the feast of Archangel Michael. But there is at least around Baona some interesting thing. If we look at texts that tell us Archangel Michael was eventually involved in stamping or in sealing, well, we do have a few references. These apocryphal, very weird texts that it's a sort of trip, no? It looks like the author taken drugs, and then they imagine dialogues of saints in the clouds, and they have flashbacks. It's quite an interesting sort of literature. There is God appearing and is doing things. Here, God is actually instituting the holy sacrament of the communion. So is taking the grain of wheat, and then he brings the seal of light, tes phragis and uin, wherewith he set a seal and taftoobe upon the worlds of light, and he sealed aftoobe, the grain of wheat in the middle hereof. And then he calls Michael and he tells him, okay, take the holy bread and give it to Adam. So Adam now knows somehow to harvest. It's the gift of agriculture, but it's of course in a Eucharistic perspective, and Michael is a big player in this. Another of the texts, the Book of the Resurrection of Christ by Bartholomew the Apostle, Archangel Michael is involved in saving and preserving the body of the son of Thomas the Apostle by sealing the body. Sphragize is the Greek verb, but it's the idea of stamping. The name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost. The best thing that I found for Michael being protecting by having his name written on things is this homily of Timothy of Alexandria, and I'm almost done. I'm sorry for the clumsiness. He says, if you wish to make the name of Michael protect you in every temptation, then write it. Write the name of Michael, Ekes Hai Empran and Michael, upon the four corners of your house, inside and outside, and write it on the clothes that you wear, and write it upon the table where you eat. And then there is a lacuna, but it fits perfectly. I checked the papyrus. It could be Ekes Hai Emperan on the bread or ik, and it will make it something. But it's very interesting. It's suggesting the dish where you eat, so the food is going to be satisfactory, and the cup where you drink, so you are protected by Michael. So remember that the seal of Archangel Michael bears the name. So when you template, there is actually the name of Michael on the bread that you eat. This is somehow following the instructions of Timothy. The idea of bread also appears several times on several homilies that are to be said in church for the feast of Archangel Michael, where Michael is involved in baking, where not himself, but you have to bake for him. You have to bake something that then you do, as you say here, in remembrance of the Archangel Michael, and then you give it to the people. So if you actually bake the bread of Michael on the day of his feast, you will be spared hell. You really are doing a very good thing. It's a deed of charity. That's the important element. It's not just you bake it. You bake it for the people who can't eat, and you do it in the name of Archangel Michael. So he will protect it, and you will benefit from it. We have several stories also in the Synaxarium, but they draw from this probably encomium or another homily by Theodosius of Alexandria, where there is a family who celebrates. It's Theodoros and Theopiste, who are every month of every year for several years baking the bread for the poor on the eve of the feast of Archangel Michael. And then there is what? There is 3 years of low Nile. So again, the concept of the flood that is very connected to Michael. So they don't have money. I mean, this is a catastrophe for them. They don't have money, but they spend everything that they had. They even sell the clothes so that they can buy the flour and bake the bread and give it to the poor. And then they have this visit from a general that they think is like a governor or somebody. And so they give him the bread and they celebrate. And eventually it's Archangel Michael. So they are blessed twice by the bread and by the presence of the Archangel Michael. And he gives them money, and they find money on a fish. It's a very interesting story. It's like they are given back what they gave as a charity. So that's it. The last thing, and I'm really done. I'm sorry for the long lecture. Is this very important text? It's called the Institutio Michaelis, or the Investiture of Archangel Michael as the replacement for Satan, in which there is now the date is perhaps 6th century, even though the text is probably later. The manuscripts are later, but the text itself is probably older. This is what I meant. And it's also, again, one of those trips. The Archangel Michael is presenting several dead people to God, like a sort of audience, and they tell him, this is a Christian who's done this very nice thing. So God is like, oh, very satisfied. And then he's presenting this other Christian who used to work 2 days and took 7 eulogies, Sashef Eulogia in Coptic Greek. The term Eulogia is here used in the translations of this text as charity, as alms. He does this work, he gets paid by the church in Eulogia, and then he gives this Eulogia to the poor. He doesn't keep it for himself, and he does it in the name of Archangel Michael. Now, my take is that here Eulogia means not just Eulogia, alms, money. It doesn't make sense to give 7 alms, but it makes sense to say they give him 7 loaves of bread. So probably they're actually talking about the Fetir el-Melek Michael that is being baked in the church or around the church, and he does work for the church, and so he's being paid by this bread because it's monthly, and he is redistributing it to the poor. A lot of Coptologists were not very happy with this translation, but if you look at the German recent dictionary of database and dictionary of Greek loanwords in Coptic, in this case, this passage from the Institutio Michaelis, the term Eulogia is in fact translated as holy blessed bread. So my take is that already in the 6th century it was being stamped. Now this image of the Archangel Michael is on an interesting manuscript, more or less from the same period, and he is represented as again as the head of the army with the cross, and he has the orb, or the imperial symbol of power, but it's weird looking, you know. It should be a sphere representing the universe, but in fact it looks like a Prosphoron, like a holy bread, you know. It has this pattern like sort of stamped in the middle, and we have Alpha Omega, Jesus Christos, and he's also carrying it with like a handkerchief, which is the typical way of handling the holy bread. So to conclude, it's not that I'm saying that Plutarch is describing something and then the Christians take and directly turn into a practice for Archangel Michael, but there are some very interesting elements from the dates, from the idea of baking, the idea of doing good and protecting others, the idea of honoring the Archangel Michael, the idea of being protected, which is very strong in contemporary Egypt, you know, the baraka that you take by eating this bread, by distributing it, by baking it in general, which is the protection of the Archangel Michael that is stamped on it. It's obviously a very complex topic. I've been a bit clumsy tonight, and I'm just exploring. So if anyone in the audience has suggestions for me, I am very happy to take them and maybe bring this forward. Thank you. Kulu sana and Tayyibin for those of you who celebrate Ramadan from tomorrow.
Thank you very much. And thank you for taking us along with your exploration of this. It was very, very interesting. We could take time for a few questions if people have them. I see there's one in Q&A. Oh, that's on the volume. So
I was at the beginning.
Yeah, you took care of that already.
Okay, there is a question. Do we know if the fatir was ever sweetened as it is usually is today? These are the only mentions, not even of the fatir, of something that is baked, connected to Archangel Michael. When we look at the Synaxar, they don't speak of honey, for example. They speak of oil and flour, which are two components of the fatir now. The only really person who speaks about fatir in the text is Iris Labib al-Masri, who had her own version of the Synaxar published in Arabic, and she reports a story from the time of the Mamluks, where more or less he does the same. He honors the Archangel Michael with bread, and he bakes it, but then there is a year of misfortune, so he cannot afford it anymore, and there's some. But otherwise, the term fatir does not appear, and the only one is this eulogia bread that I think in the very last passage, but it's we know nothing. I spoke to priests. I went to even devotional libraries, you know, these kind of books that are not very scientific, but maybe they give you some hints. There is no mention of it. It might well be something that, you know, the renaissance of the Coptic culture in the late 19th century, Pope Cyrillus the Fourth, I think, who was the one reorganizing with the music, the liturgy, the culture, the language. Maybe they came up with the idea again, and it's not that old at all. Even though there are these hints, at least from the 7th century, 6th century starting. So I really don't know. Thank you for the question, though, Phoebe Arminis.
All right. Any other comments or questions? All right. Well, thank you very much. It's been a wonderful lecture to listen to, and we hope you'll all come back for the last of our presentations, which will be on the 26th. All right.
Thank you for hosting. Thank you for being with us tonight. See you on the 26th.